The self as a social object. Basically, this is that you have a mental representation of who you are, your traits, what you are like. You see yourself almost as an object made up of all those things, your traits, your likes, your dislikes. You're made up of all those things. An important variable in this mental representation that you have of yourself is self-esteem. This is how positive or negative you feel about yourself. And research has shown that it's usually good to feel good about yourself as long as that self-esteem is real and not overly inflated. A lot of people with high self-esteem, they have what's called positive illusions. It's a rosy view of themselves that's not necessarily based in reality. For example, most people think that they are above average on characteristics like trustworthiness and their capabilities. Think about that. We can't all be above average mathematically, but most of us think that we are above average. Very similar to this is what's called the self-serving bias. Basically, that we take credit for our successes, but we deny responsibility for our failures. Like the attributions that we talked about a little bit ago. You did great on a test because you're smart, but if you did poorly on the test, it was because of something outside of your control, / the situational factors. Related to this idea of the self as a social object is self-objectification. So this is the tendency to see oneself as an object in others' eyes. And as an example of this, women, they've been socialized to think of themselves as their bodies, as objects, which can lead to all kinds of negative outcomes. Women that feel objectified may end up with body issues, shame, lower self-esteem, depression, all kinds of negative outcomes from thinking of themselves as an object like that in other people's eyes. An experimental example of this, they brought men and women into the lab and then they asked them to either try on a sweater or a swimsuit, and then they had them complete a math test. Women that had tried on the bathing suit did worse on the test. And what researchers surmised was that they think this because it brought ideas of being objectified to the surface, to being viewed as an object instead of their abilities. Basically, they were judged on their appearance and not their abilities, which is very similar to the next topic that we'll talk about, stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is when an individual fears that they are being judged based on a negative stereotype about their group. So in a stereotype relevant situation, the person feels like they may do worse like the stereotype predicts. It's very similar to the self-fulfilling prophecy that we talked about a little bit ago. As an example, a couple social psychologists, Steele and Arison, they brought in black and white students and then they had them take a test. If they just took the test, there was no difference in the test scores between the white students and the black students. If, however, before they started the test, they asked the students to check a box indicating their ethnicity, the black students did worse on the test. Does that mean that they had lower capabilities, lower abilities? No. What the researchers are saying here is that by making race relevant, the students thought about that negative stereotype that black students don't do as well on tests, and then they went on to fulfill that prophecy. With stereotype threat, it's not just race research that's been looked at, it's anything that there's a stereotype. Gender stereotypes, for example. Maybe females will do worse on a math test compared to males. Finally, in this section is what they call social comparison. Essentially that you compare your performance to others. So let's say you get a B on a test and you feel great about it. You're like, that's all I needed was a B. And then you find out your best friend got an A on the test. Now you feel bad about your test score because you are comparing it to someone else's. Research into social comparisons, they have what they call upward and downward social comparisons. An upward social comparison is when you're basically looking up to someone else. They are better off in some way. As an example, you look at someone's social media portrayals and they're all super positive, so you are looking up to them. They are better off in some way than you are. Downward social comparisons is when you're looking down on someone that's less fortunate. So like, I got to be on the test, but at least I'm not homeless. You're looking down on the homeless person in that situation. Okay, so that's the slide on self as a social object. On the next slide, we will discuss attitudes.